playing? Yep, there we go. Alright folks, hope you guys are having a great day at school while I'm out on retreat today. What I want to do is sort of make a little fireside chat for the evangelists. I actually have a video that I shot last year. So I'm just going to edit this, put a little introduction, and then you guys will watch the video from last year so you know what's going on. Just a little forewarning. My 2-year-old, who's 2 this year, last year was only 1. And we're trying to feed him, I think, during the video, and he's like in and out. You know, I think we were watching, I was just getting myself ready for the new baby and the noise that comes along with that of having a newborn in the house. So that'll be the video. Just a few reminders. Your project is due on Monday. All right, so you've got less than a week to start working on it. So there's no better time like the present. If you haven't done anything yet, you definitely want to make sure that you start working on your project a little bit, or a lot of it actually at this point. Okay, so when we look at the evangelists, right, we're section 2 here of your New Testament iBook. There's a chart, right? You want to take a screenshot of that chart and put that into Notability, and then we can edit it from there. We can highlight things, we can make notes. I know that we're going to be skipping a little bit of the stuff in section 1. Some of my classes were all in different places. Some of you got through the historical stages of how the Bible was actually written. Some of you guys are on to like King Herod and other areas. So I figured I would just save that material for when I come back on Wednesday for us to do together as a class. But for the video here, I'll cover all of the gospel writers, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay, so I hope you guys have a great day at school and enjoy the video from last year. All right, see ya. All right, so section 2 now. Let's take a look at the evangelists. Right, over in the left-hand column where it says the 4 evangelists, the very last thing on the bottom says something that's very important. There is only one gospel. We talked about this already. I'm guaranteed that's going to be a question on your quiz tomorrow. There is only one gospel, but 4 accounts of that same gospel. Remember, good news is gospel. Right? There's only one good news, and that good news is Jesus. Right? Him crucified, resurrected, and ascended to heaven. That's the good news, right? It's Jesus. There's only one. But there are 4 accounts. Think of it this way. If I ask 4 of you to go to the basketball game and to write me a story about the basketball game, they're going to be similar in the sense that the names of the teams that are competing, the score will be the same, the size of the crowd will be about the same. But depending upon your own personal interest in basketball, your paper will reflect that. And we see the same thing here being done with the evangelist. Now, what's an evangelist? If you look at that left-hand column, you'll notice that it says the 4 evangelists. The word evangelist is bolded, right? And so if you click on that, it just tells you this is a fancy name for a gospel writer. So someone who writes a gospel is an evangelist. All right, so just kind of keep that in mind. All right, so let's take a look here on page 7. Highlight that first line about Matthew, right? Matthew links Jesus' ministry to the Old Testament and to the prophecies. And that's because, right, and this is the note you want to put, Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience. Right? If he's writing to a group of Jewish converts to Christianity, John, you're really making this hard. John, what's up? What's the problem, Gus? I know. So he's writing to a group of he's writing to the Jewish converts. So he's going to try to make Jesus realize or show that he is the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. All right, I'm going to take a pause, and I'm going to come back because he's going. I gotta tuck him in. All right, we're pausing the video. All right, and we're back. Sorry about that. John's in bed, so hopefully things are a little bit quieter now. Where were we? All right, so we're doing Matthew, right? Notice first line of page 7. Matthew links Jesus' ministry to the Old Testament and prophecies. right? Highlight that, put the note, right, that the reason why Matthew is doing this is that because he's writing to a Jewish audience. Yeah, James.
Can I have my water bottle?
These kids. Another one's out. These guys. Daylight savings time. Kills us. Now schedule's all thrown off. Oh, daylight savings time. Who ever thought of that idea? I like it. I like there being lighter later, but come on. Definitely was not a guy who ever had children. Alright, so Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience, right? People who he's trying to convert to Christianity that are original Jews. So if you're going to do that, then you're going to try and show how this Jesus guy is the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies, how he is the Messiah. And so his gospel is going to have a lot of those references to the Old Testament because he's writing to people who are expecting the Messiah to be a fulfillment of the Old Testament. All right, skip down a few lines later. It says he and Luke are the only two writers to include stories about Jesus' infancy. Right, so just notice, put that highlight there. We call that an infancy narrative, right? Infancy meaning like about a baby, right, your birth, and narrative meaning a story. So it's the story about Jesus' birth. Only Matthew and Luke's Gospels contain an infancy narrative, right? As we'll see in the next chapter, they are both very different, right? Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience, so his whole thing is going to be through the perspective of Joseph, right? How does Jesus fulfill the Old Testament prophecies through Joseph, because Joseph's from the house of David, whereas Luke is speaking to Mary. Right? Luke will have spoken, was a friend of John's and of St. Paul's, and so he probably spent some time speaking to Mary, and so he is going to have his infancy narrative all from the perspective of Mary. Now, it's no wonder that Luke's infancy narrative is much, much longer. And it's just girls talk a lot more than guys, right? Their details, right, are all the same. My wife is like smirking at me now. Did you know this? I told this guy this on the retreat. The average girl said, let's start with the guy stat. The average guy says 7,000 words per day. Do you know what the average girl says? 21,000. Three times.
What about male teachers?
Yeah, male teachers. I know, right? That's why when I come home at night, I just want to sit down and listen. Right? The average girl says 3 times as many words than the guy, and that's why Luke's gospel header is about 3 times the size as far as personal experiences, right? And Luke, it's great when you read Matthew's gospel account. It's like, I didn't know if I wanted to go through this. Angel told me to go through this, so I did. We traveled to Jerusalem, to Bethlehem. There was no room for us. We found a room. Jesus was born. Boom. Some kings came. That was pretty cool. Like Luke's infancy narrative is like crazy, right? It talks all about you want to tell you about the story about Jesus? Well, let me first tell you about how the angel came to me, and then let me go back for that. Let me go back and tell you what happened to my cousin Elizabeth and how they became pregnant by an angel, and then how I became pregnant by an angel. I went to visit them and all this stuff and a lot more details and the angel singing. It's just it is what it is, right? Not a bad thing. It's just the difference. It's a difference, right? Like guys, mom and dad ask you, how was school today? Fine, right? Did you learn anything new? No, right? My school day was fine, and I never learned a single thing throughout all of high school. My sister would come home, hey Grace, how was school today? She'd be talking for 15 minutes. Just a difference, not a bad thing, just a difference. All right, move on. Next paragraph, Mark. All right, Mark's gospel is the shortest gospel. So make sure you note that. Mark's gospel is the shortest gospel. He's most likely the friend of St. Peter. So we can kind of refer to that as Peter's gospel in a sense, because Peter would have spoken to Mark, and then Mark wrote it down. All right, Luke, we're going to get back to this on the next page with the chart anyway, so I'm not worried about it. Luke is the author of the third gospel. He also writes the Acts of the Apostles, right? So make sure that you know that. He is the author of the third gospel and the Acts of the Apostles. Now, Luke, you can highlight in here as well, may have spoken directly to Mary, right? And what's pretty cool about Luke's gospel is that Luke is writing, because he's a lawyer, He's a very smart man. He's actually writing his gospel and the Acts of the Apostles as the legal brief to defend Paul, who's standing trial in Rome. Right? So Paul gets arrested by the Romans. He had bought Roman citizenship, and so as such, he gets a trial. And Luke, his friend, is the lawyer that he hires to kind of like represent him. And his whole idea is to let me try and portray these Christians and this guy Jesus as not a threat to the Roman Empire. That's why we see the stories and the phrases in Jesus' gospel about, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God's what is God's. Right? Jesus is trying to be portrayed as someone who's not a threat to the Roman Empire. Right? He's here for the poorest of the poor. He's here for everybody, not just the Jews, but Jews and Gentile alike. Right? So that's Luke's gospel. Very cool. And then finally, turn the page to John's gospel, and it says that John's gospel is the last gospel account, and this was written by John, who is the disciple that Jesus loved. All right, he was most likely the youngest of all of the apostles, and is the only apostle not to suffer a martyr's death. All right, we'll talk about that more as we go on. All right, so if you turn the page, now we're on page 9. You'll see this really beautiful chart there that we made for you. You need to know everything on this chart for your quiz tomorrow. I told you guys this on Friday, so you have the weekend to kind of study it. But let's just start with that first row across, right? So it goes Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. I kind of have that there in the sense like they're listed in the order from which they're believed to be written. Okay. So notice that first thing, synoptic, right? What I'm going to suggest that you do is I'm going to suggest that you take a screenshot of this, throw it into Notability, so that as we kind of highlight, as I talk about this stuff, you can highlight it and make some notes right on the chart. Right. So take that time now. You're screenshotting, importing into Notability. Right. While you do that, I'll poke the fire. Right. See if we can't get some more flames out of it. All right, maybe I'll throw another log on it. All right, you guys good? All right, so we're all set then. Everybody's got the chart in Notability, right? You screenshot it, put it in Notability. Good. All right, so very first row across, right? Synoptic writers. What does the word synoptic mean? We did this a long time ago. It was like the first week of school, I believe. Synoptic. Optic, right? So the word synoptic literally means with the same eye. All right, the same eye. So notice the 3 synoptic gospels are Mark, Matthew, and Luke. They all contain a lot of the same miracles, a lot of the same stories. They are written from a very similar perspective, and so they're called synoptic. All right, almost as if they're all borrowing from each other. They kind of help each other. And then John's gospel is completely different. Notice the dates at which they're written. So that's the next line down. Right? Mark and Matthew are both written between 55 and 60 AD. So that's about 25 to 30 years after Jesus' ascension into heaven. Luke is then written later on in 62 AD. We know it's 62 because we have historical records of when Paul stood trial in Rome for being a Christian. All right, and that's in 62 AD. And then John's gospel is written much later. So by the time John goes to write, he has read Matthew, Mark, and Luke's gospels most likely, and he's kind of like, all right, that's already been said. Let me say it in a different way. Or, right, you can look at it as the audience of which each one is writing to. John is writing to a community that he stays his whole life in. After Jesus ascends, John's the one that takes care of Mary, so he goes off and he is going to set up shop in Ephesus in a small Christian community, and so he can really delve deeply into the mysteries of the gospel. And so John's gospel is very symbolic, very theological, and very poetic. Okay, language used. Right, that's the next row down. All of them are written in Greek. Old Testament is written in Hebrew. Right, New Testament is written in Greek. All right, so that's an easy way across the board. Right, qualification as a writer. 2 of these guys are apostles. Right, so if you're an apostle, you automatically get dibs on writing a gospel because you're an apostle. And that's Matthew and John, right? That's where they get their authority to write a gospel from. All right. Now, what about Mark and Luke? Now, I already said this. Mark is Peter's friend, so Mark gets his authority from Peter, right? Who's the first pope. So Mark's gospel is kind of like Peter's gospel, and then Luke gets all of his information from Paul. So Luke's gospel is kind of like Paul's gospel, who's an apostle. All right. So all their gospels date back directly to an apostle if they weren't actually written by an apostle. All right. The image of Christ is going to be linked very closely to the audience. So we will do that together. All right. Notice the audience for Mark's gospel is he's writing to Romans, Christians under persecution in Rome. So what is the image of Christ that he's going to portray? The image of the sufferings of Christ. All right. He's going to show that Jesus is this suffering servant, trying as a way to say, look, Christians in Rome who are persecuted, Jesus is suffering with you. All right, and he's not asking anything more of you than he asks of himself. Okay. Next, Matthew. Remember, Matthew is writing to his audience is to these Jewish converts. So his whole image of Christ is going to be that of a rabbi, someone who fulfills the Old Testament prophecies and the Old Testament laws. Luke is writing to Gentiles. Remember, he's writing to the Romans who are in charge of Rome. He's writing to anyone who's not Jewish. And so his whole image of Christ is going to focus on how Jesus is here for the poor, for the outcast, how he's a healer. He's here for everybody. He's not just here for the Jewish people, right? Because he's writing to people who are not Jews and who don't even know who this guy Jesus is. Right? And finally, John is going to stress the divinity of Jesus, right? That he is the Son of God. And we'll see that right away with the very first words of John from his gospel, right? Where he connects it back to the creation story. All right. The reason why John's able to do this, kind of what I already mentioned, is that John is writing to this specific small community in Ephesus, Turkey. And he is able to grow with them and really delve deeper into the mysteries of the gospel and into Jesus' life because he spends every day with them for the remainder of his life. All right. Style of writing. Mark is very choppy, unrefined, right? His writing would kind of be like if you guys would write something, very like to the point, straightforward, not very fancy, just writing, right? Matthew's writing, of course, is going to have a lot of references to the Old Testament because he's writing to these Jewish converts. Luke's writing is very well done. He's kind of like a master's level or a doctorate level student would write. Someone, like one of your English teachers could probably pull that off. Writing as his right, but John's writing is very, very high, lofty Greek. It's very stylistic, very poetic, very symbolic. That's kind of like Shakespeare, right? He's like very, very poetic gospel. Everything mirrors itself, right? It's broken up into sections. It's very beautifully written. Okay. Other New Testament works. Luke also wrote the Acts of the Apostles. Right. John also wrote the book of Revelation and 3 different letters. If you ever want to read a whole book of the Bible, if you ever want to read some other books of the Bible, the 3 letters of John are very short. They're like a page and a half. You can read it in a sitting, right, in one night. Unless you read really slow, then you can read it in 2 nights. Theological theme, that mirrors the images of Christ, right? So we already did that. Okay, so that's kind of where we're going to leave it for today. All right, folks, so I hope you enjoy the rest of your school day, and I know you have your choice of scripture classes. As always, thank you for choosing mine. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. Don't forget to check your backpack for some.